Hi, everyone. So this is our final week of Module 4. And in this week, we're really looking at some of the anti-aging molecules, compounds, medications, substances, techniques, methods, and just where the current research is as far as anti-aging interventions. And so you're tasked this week with finding your own molecule or compound, whatever it may be, doing a bit of research on that, and then presenting that in this week's discussion, along with appropriate references to support that so that your peers can do their own bit of research accordingly. And so I thought I would also contribute this week and share not so much a single compound or a single molecule or anything like that, but speak about the work of Dr. David Sinclair, who I think is really a pioneer in the field of anti-aging. He works out of a Harvard lab, and he's a professor of genetics at the Harvard Medical School. And he works specifically and runs the Center for Biology of Aging. And I think he's done a lot of very amazing things in the field. His overall approach, his overall idea about aging, I think is just cutting edge, record breaking. He does not believe that we should be aging. His idea is that aging is just like another disease, like heart disease or diabetes, and that we can do the necessary things in order to investigate it and study it and to avoid it and to prevent it and to delay it as much as we can. And so he thinks that our future generations are going to look back and laugh at the fact that we used to just accept aging as a natural matter of fact. And if you really think about it, we don't accept any other disease. We don't accept cancer. We're fighting cancer. We're fighting to learn more about it, to understand it, to find therapies and targets and cures. And so why do we accept aging? It's a really eye-opening question, and I really appreciate his kind of futuristic stance on aging overall. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about some of his works and some of the things that he has suggested and that he's done himself. He has a very personal connection to anti-aging. He's about 50 years of age, but he looks very young, and that's kind of one of the commentaries that he gets, in the biogerontology field. He also takes some of the medications personally that I'm going to talk about, and he, has a personal connection, personal experience with some of these therapies. He also but he also has his father on some of these therapies. His father is 80 years of age, and I'm going to talk about some videos where you can listen more about his own personal story. But his father's 80 years of age and has reversed a lot of his aging-related conditions and is much more active, leads a very healthy, active lifestyle at his age. And he talks about his mother's battle with cancer. And so there's a lot of personal connection to his influence in the field and to some of the therapies and some of the mechanisms, just his overall stance on anti-aging. He also wrote the book Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. Very interesting book that I'm currently reading. And so I encourage you to follow him. I usually follow him on his social media platforms. He's talked a lot about the context of the COVID pandemic and anti-aging and the coronavirus and anti-aging and so on. So a lot of great work that he's doing. And I'm going to speak about some of the therapies that he is currently taking and that he supports. So he's taking Reservatrol. I'll talk about the mechanism and some of the reported benefits of Reservatrol. It's actually found in red wine. He also takes nicotinamide mononucleotide. And then other important things relative to anti-aging are metformin. He takes metformin. So I'll talk about these three therapies along with Vapormycin, which is another therapy that he's done some work with. Okay. So the first one is Reservatrol, and I'm going to share all of these articles that I'm pulling up here on Brightspace as well. I'm going to put them in a folder. But Reservatrol is similar to calorie restriction. The mechanism is not quite clear, but it's found in red wine. And this study actually compares the mechanism and properties of Reservatrol and those of calorie restriction. We talked about calorie restriction previously. And they both seem to have a very similar efficacy, a very similar mechanism in terms of turning on some of those pathways that we talked about, specifically aligning with the AMPK pathway the same way that calorie restriction does. And so they have a very similar efficacy. Okay, and so if you can prevent calorie restriction and some of the nuances of calorie restriction and simply take a glass of red wine, I'm sure many persons would choose that. And so that's kind of the underlining outcome of this study is that resveratrol and calorie restriction exhibit a very similar anti-aging activity. And we already spoke about the undisputed benefits of calorie restriction as it pertains to anti-aging. Alrighty. Let's look at another article here. So this other article has to do with metformin. And as I mentioned, Dr. David Sinclair, he also takes metformin. Again, the mechanism of how metformin acts is not clear. Metformin is a diabetes medication. That's where we first learned about metformin, but it has since kind of been hijacked by the biogerontology community as a medication that definitely has some anti-aging properties and benefits. And here, if we really dig in, we see that same type of mechanism being brought about, that AMPK pathway being turned on, and the ability for cells to really regulate their own repair and replication, and to prevent over-replication, you know, the type of cellular activity that we talked about that leads to things like cancers and overgrowths, and just to keep all that in check and turn on this AMPK pathway. So we see a very similar mechanism here, again, aligning with that calorie restriction and the resveratrol, as I mentioned. And so we're finding that this type of effect in the cell is a common thread to anti-aging, turning on those AMPK pathways, allowing for better lipid oxidation, allowing for better metabolism of glucose, of lipid as well. And so that's kind of the general theme that we see with metformin as well. It has a lot of promise as it pertains to anti-aging. It's been studied in many other species, worms, flies, rats, and then we also know that it's been studied quite a bit in diabetes as well. Okay, let's move on briefly to another medication here. This is called Vapormycin. And Vapormycin still has quite a ways to go as far as the benefits that it can provide and, you know, studies that are done on this. So this is an opinion article. But rapamycin is thought to inhibit the opposite pathway of AMPK. It is actually the target of mTOR. So mTOR actually stands for target of rapamycin. So it basically is going to inhibit mTOR, that pathway that we talked about, that is the opposite of the AMPK pathway. And so that is thought to be its mechanism of action. It's been studied a bit on, you know, mice and flies and rats as well, and worms. And it has kind of a controversial effect. It's not a safe medication. There definitely are a few side effects and adverse effects. Because it was definitely first studied as a chemotherapy medication. And so there are some harsh side effects to this medication. But again, when we overall look at the mechanism of action and why it kind of works, we see that it has this starvation mimetic property. And that kind of is aligning with that same theme that I'm talking about. The AMPK pathway aligning with that calorie restriction effect, aligning with that ability to clean up and regulate activities, cellular activities, and prevent overgrowths, and preventing the types of effects that we see with excess calories and not allowing the cell enough time and enough space and enough of the resources and tools that it needs to do that kind of deep cleaning analogy that I talked about last time. So rapamycin has been viewed as this partial starvation mimetic. So it kind of mimics that calorie restriction state that we put the body in that has the benefits that I'm talking about as it pertains to some of the other medications. And then I do want to also share this article. This is a very recent article. This was published this year, and it's called "The Programming to Recover Youthful Epigenetic Information and Restore Vision." This is an article published by Dr. Sinclair out of his lab with some of his associates. And basically one of his newest mechanisms of anti-aging has to do with genetics. So unlocking genes that he thinks are available within our cells that can reprogram us back to an earlier age. And so he has done this again on himself and on his father. But he's also done this much more fruitfully on mice, and he's been able to restore vision in mice by restoring the earlier genetics, the earlier genes and stored DNA within the cells of these mice before they became blind. And so he was able to restore function of the optic nerve, which is really promising in this field. And so his whole idea here, again, is that we can take some of our genes that are kind of locked away. They're genes and DNA that's stored there that we don't have access to easily because of our lifestyle, because we've kind of forgotten through evolutionary mechanisms, forgotten how to access these youthful DNA is what he called them. And so when we are able to tap into these kind of hidden away, locked away, kind of earlier copies of ourselves, earlier copies of our DNA from when we were, babies. If we can tap into that DNA, we can kind of rewind our clock and reprogram those youthful DNA and kind of literally reverse aging. And he's done this on mice again, and he has a lot of, optimism that there's promise here that can be applied to humans. Obviously, there's still a long way to go in terms of testing this out and seeing something, readily available on the market that's kind of widespread that we can use and prescribe. But this is definitely kind of a crack in that, that surface in terms of anti-aging, okay? I'm also going to share with you two very helpful videos. So one is a shorter video. Let's see here. All right, here we go. So I've shared the articles that I just spoke about here, and they're in this folder called Anti-Aging Research in Module 4. And then I'm also sharing two videos at the bottom. One is a very brief 14 or 15-minute video, which kind of goes through an overview of his most recent study, that kind of unlocking those youthful genes and being able to reverse ourselves to a previous version by tapping into those stored youthful genes. And then a second video, which I'm also sharing, is a much more lengthy, I think it's about an hour. So if you have time, you can, in the future, or whenever you can make time, look at this more lengthy video where he really explains how he has done this work, all of the medications and kind of the mechanisms that I've talked about. And he also talks a bit about some of the earlier theories and how he views some of those theories, such as the telomere theory, the mitochondrial theory, the antioxidant theory. And by the way, these calorie restriction mechanisms, these AMPK pathway, also target these three mechanisms, right? The telomere theory, the mitochondrial theory, as well as the antioxidant and the ROS theory as well. So very interesting, quite lengthy video that he has done. It's actually a masterclass that he's done, which I think is very cutting edge and very advanced in terms of where the study is going to be going. Right. So I look forward to hearing some of your contributions, some of the, molecules and compounds and substances that you guys come up with, whether it's creams or fruits or foods like wine, where we see that resveratrol found. Definitely eager to hear some of your contribution.